Hello and welcome to the Temple Mount podcast. I am Shogun. Joining me today for the second time on my podcast is JoshInTheShell. But last time was so long ago we didn't even record our episodes back then. They were just live events all the way back in 2019. So exciting to have you back on the show all this time later. Today's topics will be social engineering, collective consciousness, and hypnotic language, topics that I'm very interested in. But before we get started, please just make sure you've followed and subscribed to our various content channels, the Roundtable SoundCloud and YouTube channels, and the Temple Mount SoundCloud and YouTube channels can all be found at the top of the Temple Mount Discord server. And I hope you've joined us there. We do this event every day, these events every day. Just check the announcements channel for upcoming content. That being said, welcome, JoshInTheShell. Thank you for joining me. How are you, my friend?
It's great to be back. Like I was saying just before we started the podcast, it's definitely been a while. Stuff got in the way, but this is kind of a topic that I don't really get to talk about with my clients very much, and it's kind of some of the bigger stuff that really interests me. But I end up just working on a much smaller scale with a lot of the psychology and um, NLP and things like that I do on a daily basis.
So you are like a clinical therapist of some kind to discuss?
So the term that I started using, um, although it's now been a little more popular than when I first started out, is charisma coach, because I try to focus on social interaction and things that are genuinely helpful, because a lot of the techniques that I use can be scaled up and are basically the same on a personal scale to a societal scale, and at a certain point it gets a little too, I don't know, invasive, gross. It gives me the heebie-jeebies when I think about what potentially could be done, and that's kind of what interests me about the social engineering aspect. Is that's something I can teach. I can teach social engineering on a more personal level, which is basically all flirting is. And then at the same time, there's the more macro level that just gets kind of uncomfortable. So I definitely try to stick to more personal things in my daily work.
I see. So tie this in then to social engineering. It's a topic or a concept I'm very interested in. How would you define social engineering, and then how would it connect to like charisma coaching?
Well, social engineering kind of has two definitions these days. One of the more commonly used ones would just be um, information gathering based on engineered social cues. So phishing emails and fake websites and stuff like that to try and grab your information. Posts that you see online, the whole 10-year challenge, the um, like the come up with cities that what city were you born at, like random stuff like challenges, quote unquote, that you see on like Facebook all the time. That's 9 times out of 10 they have a bot trolling through all the comments to pick up all the information they can, get your security questions, stuff like that. That's the more common use, but it also has the meaning of to, I guess, to engineer or to manipulate some kind of societal structure. Usually they're talking about society at large, but it could also be as simple as a group of people in a bar to make some kind of social change. So when it comes to more on the personal level, we're really just talking about either flirting, which would be you and one other person. You are essentially engineering social responses that garner some kind of relationship or a one night stand or whatever it is that you want for that night. Or it could be one of the jobs that I used to have was entertainment host. Essentially, what I would do is I would go out to bars and I would effectively talk to people, and I would kind of get the mood up to the point where people would want to go into that bar more because it looks like it's bustling. And I would get people more into conversation, get people more engaged with each other. And that is, another, I guess, more positive form of social engineering. But all the same techniques can be scaled up or down based on what your intentions are.
So with social engineering, could it be described as like human systems intervention? Like, would that be one way to explain it? Like, is it a way to interact with or influence human systems to achieve some kind of specific aim? Would that be accurate?
Yeah, I guess social influence would be a very succinct way of putting that. Just influencing some kind of social group in one way or another towards a specific goal. The engineering part of that, and it kind of infers that you have a specific goal in mind, whereas just overall influence could simply be you're out there having fun and it happens to, like, the vibe of the location happens to change because of your energy or because of what you're doing, but not because you intend to change it.
I see. So, what would be some of these techniques that you might teach, or even just general categories of these kind of techniques, just as examples?
One of the, well, two of the strategies that I teach the most would be um, teaching state control and teaching the emotional refractory period. So with state control, um, a state would be like a state of being or a state of mind, which could include emotions or um, almost any word that you can use to describe yourself would essentially be considered a state. Um, but where that comes in handy is as you get better at controlling that, pretty much all interactions are a clash of your state and the state of the group or the state of the other person. And eventually one will win over. Well, either one will win over or both parties will split and go their separate ways. And there's no in between with that. So, well, I guess you would consider the interaction the kind of in between. But you stay long enough, and eventually one state will win out over the other. So if I come into a situation where people are just kind of sitting there and bored, I can come in with a more active state, a state of excitement or a state of fun. And as I interact with these people, they will either start having more fun or I'll just move on and go somewhere else if that's what I decide to do. Um, so with state control, all you're doing is kind of putting your intent into the situation and either staying long enough to kind of power your state into that group or just give up and move on. Um, the emotional refractory period is kind of related, where your state is kind of held onto by your brain. So, one of the techniques you can use is if you see people having fun, then they're in the emotional refractory period of fun. So, if something happens that kind of ruins the mood, if you can get people having fun again, they will very, very easily start having fun very quickly. So that's something that it's the same basic concept of your brain is lazy, and because it's been having fun for so long, or because you've been depressed for so long, your brain looks for things to continue that state. So, if you're depressed but you start feeling better, your brain for a specific time afterwards, which is usually half the length of time that you were in that state, you will be looking for things that make you feel that same way, because that way your brain doesn't have to do all the work to completely shift to another state.
So you're saying your brain will look to reinforce its own existing state by
Yeah,
finding information that confirms it or reinforces it because it's
right.
easier than changing to a different state.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the same mechanism that you use if you've been told repeatedly how many red cars there are or how many more red cars there are. than you've noticed before, the next time you go out, you will continue to notice more red cars. If you stay inside long enough, eventually that will go away. But the next time you go outside, you'll see another red car and your brain's back on that path. It's the exact same mechanism.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Before we move on from the topic of social engineering, could you give people any more sort of just a description or example of social engineering in action, or just something that might help them grasp it a little more clearly in their mind?
Um, yeah, let me think about that for a second.
So, like, could you give an example, like, of a practice of social, like, applied social engineering that you've done or that someone could do? How it would
Um,
actually go down?
yeah, so usually what I would do when I was an entertainment host is I would go in and I would find the largest group. So that kind of harkens to the emotional refractory period. It's already a large group. So I wanted to build on that group instead of make a whole new one. So I find the largest group of people, even if they're not facing each other, and I would start to spark up conversation, find the most entertaining things I can find, make sure that people are involved so that they are in a state of involvement. They're in, the whole group is starting to have more fun. And then as I see new people, I would then, you know, uh, maybe in the middle of a sentence or maybe in reacting to someone, I would lean over or walk over and just be like, hey, come join. Or even something as simple as um, just looking over and acknowledging that they're there and then going back to the conversation. And as that would grow, as that group energy, that group state would grow, it would become more infectious to the people around it. And so within a span of 20, 30 minutes, you'd have a completely full bar.
Cool. Very cool. So it's charisma is sort of about your own personal energy being effective on the group. Is that
Yeah, so that's literally all charisma is your ability to impart your own state onto other people. And that's for better or for worse because you can have a very angry, charismatic person like Lewis Black, for instance. He's a very angry comedian, but people still enjoy it. People still grab onto that state, and they'll even jokingly yell at each other after his performance because they're still in that emotional refractory period because he got them into that state.
right? And is charisma primarily an innate ability that some people have and others don't, or
Um,
uh,
no, I certainly used to think that when before I developed these skills, but I would not have any of these skills if that were true. So it's definitely something that can be learned. It just takes time and effort. It can be learned by anyone and everyone.
I see. So the second topic you outlined in our discussion of the podcast was collective consciousness. So can you explain that and tie it into social engineering?
Yeah, and one of the reasons I wanted to talk about that is because when I was describing social engineering, I was kind of describing a phenomenon that I can only describe as collective consciousness. And I actually don't know a ton about the subject. I just wanted to talk about it because it's something I've observed in my practice. And, it's I just find it so interesting. So again, harkening back to let's say a comedy show, any comedy show. You're sitting in an audience. If the comedian is funny, you're all laughing. If the comedian is bad, you're all sitting in silence or you're all booing. If one person starts throwing a tomato, mob mentality will kick in and more people start throwing tomatoes, that classic booing off a stage. But it's just because in that particular environment, it is very easy to kind of collectivize experience and for the state of the audience to kind of meld into one because they're all sitting there. They all have one leader at the front, which is the comedian. The comedian sets the state, sets the tone, and the audience is almost acting as one organism at that point. And, I notice the same thing happens with protests, with religious events. Um, I'm not going to necessarily dive into anything spiritual on that topic, but religious events, meaning, um, sporting events, register in the same part of the brain as a religious sermon that you're attending. Um, it's very much a product of, or I would say it's a phenomenon that simply occurs whenever you have groups of people interacting with each other on any scale. And it's more of just something that happens that social engineers will take advantage of rather than something that is invented. And again, I don't know exactly where it comes from. I know some of the psychology to it, I know some of the neuroscience, but not all of it really. There's not a single answer that explains why that's the case. I've just noticed that it tends to be.
Interesting. Yeah, and there's certainly a number of examples of collective consciousness that
Right.
are interesting. Like, they talk about the hundredth monkey effect when,
Hmm.
like, essentially a certain group of people have like an idea, or someone has an
Hmm.
idea, other people start having that same idea nearby,
Right.
even though they haven't like communicated about it.
Hmm.
And of course, yeah, and the emotions that crowds feel can be totally overwhelming. I mean, I had that when
Oh
I
yeah.
went to the UFC. The pure amount of like adrenaline and
Right.
excitement completely overwhelms and you just like lose your mind. It's kind of crazy, but that's very interesting. And the final topic that you announced was hypnotic language. So, can you tell
Yes.
us a little bit about hypnotic language?
Yeah, and again, it kind of fits back in with the social engineering. A good social engineer will use hypnotic language. Um, but one of the things I wanted to talk about is simply the fact that, like most of the things that I can teach about social engineering or negotiation or sales or anything like that, um, there are benevolent versions of a thing and there are uh, malevolent versions of a thing. So the benevolent version of hypnotic language is good storytelling. All of the same language patterns that I can teach that will put someone into a trance or surreptitiously implant ideas into people's heads, incept them, if you will. Um, these are all the same things that make a good book, that make a lecture fun to listen to and interesting, something that is so engaging that you're not thinking about anything else. It's more than likely using hypnotic patterns because it's just all taking advantage of the same way that our brain tends to function.
So, are there specific like frequencies of voice, like tone of voice, specific cadences or speeds of
Um,
speaking, or is it more about the choice of words that makes it hypnotic?
well, it's kind of all of the above. So when we talk about frequency of voice, the deeper the voice, the deeper and slower that you go, you'll start to notice that it starts to feel more, uh, I don't want to say calming, but inviting. And this is actually true both for male and female voices, animal and human voices. Um, but that's to us specifically. Um, and it's also affected by your tonality and pacing. So there are things like the command tonality and the inquisitive tonality. But at the same time, once you start getting into those, like the word patterns, the phrasing patterns, the command and inquisitive tonalities, those are English specific. So one of my goals when I get the time to spend on it is to try to find a more universal structure that can be taught in any language for these patterns. But for now, what I can speak to outside of the pitch of the voice is going to be very specific to English speakers.
Okay. Well, I happen to be one, and I know that everyone in the server is one as well. So, can you talk
Thankfully.
a little bit about that then? How it applies in English specifically? I mean.
Right. Yeah. Well, in English specifically, again, the tonality, so a command tonality goes down at the last part that you say, whereas an inquisitive tonality starts to go up. Again, that was, of course, just an example of the two, but one of the techniques you can use is something called an embedded command, which is where you take the words that you want to be your subtle command, the thing that you want the other person to do. And with practice, what you can do is weave that in. And when you get to that point, so an example would be maybe you're at hypnotherapy or something like that. And during your induction into hypnosis, they will say something like, you may notice that as you start to fall asleep, as you continue to rest and relax, and that part where they say fall asleep in that command tonality, there's also a pause, and then they continue. So something like that is very subtle, but that alone is not very useful because there is no way to, without any other hypnotic language techniques, and this goes for almost all of the hypnotic patterns that you can learn or try on their own, they will produce the result you're looking for. But if you only use one or two and then leave it at that, you will have no control over when or where those suggestions take place, and you will have no control over how they their brain will interpret what you're saying, because of course everyone still communicates at least slightly differently than everyone else, because they're all a product of their own mind and a product of the people they've been around their whole lives. So you need a full tool set of these for them to be properly useful. But um, one of the most nefarious patterns, or rather, one of the easiest patterns to use, and the one that most people tend to use accidentally, because again, good communicators will show these patterns just naturally. Good storytellers will use these patterns just naturally. There's a pattern called pacing and leading. And quite by accident, that happens to be what live news is simply pacing and leading. Um, and that kind of ends up becoming a problem because a pace is a truism, something that can be verified. So if they're showing video footage and they say something like, as you can see here, the man entered through the door at this time and he was wielding what appears to be a weapon. As you go through these things that you can see and verify with your eyes as they're speaking, eventually your brain will start to simply accept things as true. And that's where the lead comes in. So if they inject any opinions or if they get any facts slightly wrong, your brain will accept that information as true just automatically. Um, so it becomes kind of tricky because I think the only way to not have that happen is to have a discussion show where not everyone agrees, and then they would have to show, pause, discuss, show, pause, discuss. Kind of like what you see on YouTube, which is why I tend to try and get more of my news from YouTube. It's also just more entertaining, but you have more discussions with people who don't necessarily agree with each other, and so it kind of negates the whole pacing and leading aspect of you have this, and now I believe that. Well, now the person listening also believes that.
Fascinating. So if someone wanted to start developing charisma or these abilities that you're describing, what would be the very first thing you'd recommend that they start doing or trying to
Um,
do?
the first thing I would recommend doing would be doing things like power poses and working on their posture, especially if we're talking about my standard clientele. Definitely need to work on posture. If you do not have a straight back with your shoulders back, then you are kind of setting yourself up for failure in a way. Now, you don't always need to be in that posture. Your posture will fluidly change throughout the day with what you're doing, but your your physiology and your posture and your mental state, your state as we discussed earlier, they're all inexorably linked. They all play off of each other. So as you get more depressed, you'll start to slouch more, you'll start to close off your body language more. So, in order to start building confidence and have the confidence enough to work on your charisma, you need to be able to give yourself that kind of posture. You need to have the posture of someone who's confident so that you can tell your body to release those hormones that make you confident, to make it easier for you to get to that state. Um, but after that, um, just some of the more subtle techniques can make you more charismatic as well. Um, there's something called matching and mirroring, but there's a very easy kind of miniature version of that I always teach first, which is the echo technique. Literally, just if you don't know what to say, use their own words back at them, maybe change it up a little. And as you get more practice with that, you can start weaving their words into things that you're saying a little bit more fluidly, a little bit more naturally. But as you continue to give them their own words, they will interpret your words as their words. And so that will very quickly build rapport with someone, and it will very quickly get them to believe what you say and to do what you say. And
So,
all it takes is just a little practice.
just as an example, so you're saying something like if someone said, my father voted for Trump and he had a nice boat that he liked to drive back and forth in the ocean, then when you talk back, you'd be like, yeah, yeah, boats it's in the ocean too. And my dad, he also always say something like that.
Yeah, and it doesn't even matter what order you say those in. So, to use your example, just, yeah, my dad voted for Trump and he's got a nice boat out in the ocean. And I could say back, I'd always love a nice boat out in the ocean. But, I don't know about my dad. I don't know if my dad also voted for Trump. So, with a little practice, you can you can say something genuine, but as you use their words and their phrases, it makes it just a little bit more, I don't want to say convincing, but it gets you a little bit more into their head. And it's one of the easy ways to start out when people, a lot of my clients have trouble just knowing what to say in general conversation. Um, I will say, just take part of it and turn it into a question. Oh, your dad has a boat out in the ocean? That's pretty cool. Or, oh, your dad voted for Trump? How do you feel about that? Or even just, oh, your dad voted for Trump? And don't even say anything else. The only word you changed was my to your.
So the key part is mirroring back their words, or at least trying to say the same words back. And is it also copying their body language?
Yeah, so when you get into the full version of matching and mirroring, mirroring is either words, tonalities, or body language. You're giving them back exactly what they give you. Whereas matching is doing something similar, but not exactly the same. So, from a body language perspective, if they're leaning back in their chair, you can also lean back in your chair. Or if you want to match instead of mirror, as they lean back in their chair, you lean forward in your chair. Or lean sideways would be a little bit more appropriate in that situation. But at that point, you're both leaning. Or if they are tapping their pencil on the table, you can tap your thumbs together. They're both tapping, but slightly different. Or you can mirror the exact thing. They're tapping an eraser on the table, you tap an eraser on the table. And this kind of matching and mirroring, that's actually one way that some hypnotists will use to do a very subtle induction. Um, I have seen it done in a coffee shop just as a proof of concept, where a guy sits in a corner, finds a target that he's decided he wants to try and induce a hypnotic state into. And he was matching, well, actually, he was mirroring his movements at all times as closely as possible. And then when he was sure that he had it, he just, and this is, you can consider matching and mirroring as a kind of pacing. He was pacing him, matching and mirroring, and then he led. Once he knew that he had him, he just went limp as if he just passed out. And the guy did the same, just without thinking about it, without even knowing what was going on. He just goes limp.
So does that mean that this is almost a sort of a mind control technique where you can kind of like hijack other people's behavior and make them act in certain ways?
Yes and no. I mean, again, like I said earlier, everything is kind of, um, it can be scaled and it can be changed, and it all depends on intent, because these are the same processes that occur naturally. Just like with hypnotic language patterns, matching and mirroring, hypnotic patterns in general, um, it's also just kind of what happens naturally as you begin to build rapport with someone. As you speak to someone, if you do start to naturally build rapport, you will naturally start to match and mirror each other's body language. You will naturally start to use each other's words. So, this is just doing that, but on purpose. And most of the hypnotic language patterns are just taking things that people already do naturally and doing it on purpose, because the brain doesn't know the difference. So, mind control is just taking the way that we naturally communicate and doing it on purpose with a specific intent. The same with social engineering. That's just a larger form of mind control using the concept or the phenomenon of mob mentality or collective consciousness to, um, mind control on a larger scale.
I see. Very interesting. I have more questions, but maybe should we ask if the audience has any questions or comments at this point?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be more than happy to answer any questions people might have, anything that I haven't said yet, or anything they're still confused on, or anything they want to trip me up with, because definitely not the most knowledgeable on all of this, just the things that, I don't know, I had a good way of putting that. Totally blanked out.
No worries. But does anyone in the audience have a question for Josh? If not, are
Yeah,
there?
it's definitely going on. I've been reading Jacques Ellul's book, Propaganda. He classifies it as it's all encompassing. So, particular messages will be in magazines, in books, on TV, radio, billboards, everywhere, and it's constant. It's over years and years and years that you're subjected to this, and it gradually, builds up a reality that we all believe in. So it's constant and all pervasive. There were other aspects to it as well. So it's not outright lying, because I know. Well, I guess we'd eventually pick up that. But
Yeah, for propaganda to truly be effective, there must be at least some element of truth to it.
yeah, often there's lies by omission, of course.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Do you have any suggestions that's for people who um, are becoming aware of having the more malicious version being done to them? Like, how can somebody, like, how can they spot those things? Okay, so the mirroring, it's easy to spot, right? But
Right.
Well, what I
Well,
would recommend you read old books.
Oh,
Sorry, go ahead, Josh.
oh, no worries. For the most part, for a lot of the more common techniques, like pacing and leading, matching and mirroring, simply knowing about it can be enough. Looking for it can be enough. Um, but for some of the trickier techniques or the more subtle techniques, like embedded commands or some of the other God, I'm blanking out right now, and I left my iPad in the other room, so I can't. I have a flow chart on the hypnotic patterns I probably should have grabbed, but there are other um, what is it?
techniques.
I had a specific one in my head, and it just now it's going to bother me. Anyway, like generalizations and kind of the vagaries of hypnotic language. Um, Essentially, one of the best ways to combat this is to talk about things with other people. Um, and specifically, if you can do it while it's happening or directly afterwards and talk about that subject with someone else, then that can at least get your brain out of that kind of hypnotic trance. If you notice yourself glazing over, glazing over out of boredom is still technically a type of trance. So, if you can catch yourself going into states that you don't want, and again, state control comes in handy a lot. If you can control what state you're in, or it at the very least notice when you're going into a hypnotic state, you can consciously pull yourself out of it.
Now, what do you think about a situation where, like you were mentioning before, right? This is a natural thing where people start to
Mhm.
mirror each other if they like each other,
Yeah.
right? Or if one person likes another one, then they start to mirror that person. Well, what if one person is doing that naturally without trying to, manipulate or whatever, but yet the other person notices that and then becomes defensive against that? Any
Um,
any thoughts on that? Because, that
hmm,
could also be a natural, I guess, response, but because people are becoming aware of that being
mhm.
used as a manipulation tactic, they're almost like paranoid about it in some cases, right?
Right. Yeah, no, I've definitely been there myself. That's a really good question. What I would say, and I'll probably need to do a lot more thinking on this before I have a good answer, but the answer I can think of now would be uh, once you break out of your rapport with them, you can, depending on how well you know this person, you can ask yourself what their intentions are. um if you feel like you don't know whether or not they are trying to do something nefarious, you can observe for a moment and then either allow yourself back into rapport if you don't think that they have bad intentions, or if you just can't shake it. um that would be something I'd have to look into, because that's it becomes easier with practice. I will say that you get a better radar for these things with practice, but that's, you know, now that you've asked that question, that is not a good answer for that, because it's probably a good idea to have something specific for that situation. So I'll have to think about that.
Okay, perfect. Thanks.
Thank you. Does anyone else have a question or comment for Josh? Josh, are there any other tactics or techniques or tricks you wanted to tell us about today?
Yeah. So one of the, I think, a couple of the easiest techniques that I will use both to induce a mild hypnotic state, um, or to break myself or someone else out of a hypnotic state is something called a state break. Um, I'm actually in the middle of teaching one of my clients about this week, so it's very fresh in my mind. A state break is something that, it's exactly what it sounds like. If you are in a certain state, whether that be happiness, depression, a hypnotic state, um, a state of attraction, any state. Again, state is a very vague term on purpose. It's your state of being in that moment, your state of mind. Um, there are certain ways that you can break that state, and most of these are only breaking the state momentarily. So, one very reliable state break is saying your name. So if in the middle of saying something, I, either looked at him or, I was just in the middle of saying something and Shogun, you might think to yourself, wait, what is he going to ask me? Only because I said your name. Or you might completely forget what you were just thinking about because I said your name. And your name to you is very powerful. Now, if I said his real name, which I saw once and I've now forgotten and I will continue to forget, because I don't really care, because to me he's Shogun. Um, if I said his given name, again, that would have even more sway over him. You see a lot of, I guess you would say, like spell work and old stories about the power of knowing something's name, and that comes from a very real experience where saying your name breaks you out of a state, which is why when I've consulted for call centers, some of these call centers are like, they want their employees to say, okay, Shogun, so what we're going to do here, Shogun, is open up your phone to this website, and Shogun, once you've gotten that, I'm like, oh, good Lord. um, so for so many reasons we don't want to do that, but more specifically, if we put it in the wrong place, if I was guiding Shogun through a certain series of steps to, I don't know, reset his phone or something. If I broke the state at just the wrong place, he would be in a state of learning or in a state of listening. And if I break that, I run the risk of him rapidly choosing a new state. And that's where you get, that's why sometimes a name sounds rude. When someone says your name, sometimes it sounds very personable, but other times it sounds rude. It's where it's placed and what state it's breaking. But another easy way to break a state would be to interrupt a pattern. So if someone is in the middle of saying something and you just straight up interrupt them, that will break their state. But again, if you do that wrong, if you do it at the wrong time or with the wrong intention, they'll pick up on that and their new state will be confrontational because you're being confrontational. And they'll pick up immediately on that state. But one of the more entertaining versions is, a lot of times you'll see like Darren Brown or other TV hypnotists do the handshake induction, where they go for a handshake, but before the hands actually touch, they will move the hand either to the side, jerk it down, or put it into their face. Because a handshake in Western society is an automatic reaction. So your brain is already on autopilot. You interrupt the pattern, you break their previous state, and the moment that you say sleep, instantly they go into a state that mimics sleep. Now, it doesn't last forever. A state break does not last forever, but it does break them out of whatever state they were in before. So it can be very, very helpful. So if I want people to answer genuinely during a lecture, like, of course, during lectures, I will usually use some hypnotic patterns. So people will start to glaze over. They will start to kind of go into that trance. So I will add like a tag question at the end of what I'm saying. A tag question is another state break. And I will say something like, and that, of course, is something that can be very interesting, can't it? Your brain is hardwired to try and answer a question, breaks them out of the state. And so I will then move into a more discussion based form instead of just strictly lecture. But if I don't break the state in between those two modes, people will be so confused they won't know to answer my questions or to ask me questions because I did it wrong. Kind of a long rant, but hopefully I didn't confuse anyone.
No, that was great. This is really, really good material. Thank you. So again, I'm just ask, is there any other techniques or tactics you'd like to walk people through? Just maybe one final example of an application of this, or something they can try and think about or apply.
Yeah, what I would say is while it is somewhat difficult to learn how to use embedded commands, what I would recommend, especially for people who have a naturally inquisitive tonality, so people who tend to end their sentences on an upward inflection, like I did just there, to try and add more command tonality into what they say. So try to work on adding a downward inflection around parts of your sentence that you believe are important or at the end of your sentence. So that can be as simple as at a restaurant, instead of saying, "Hey, can I have a glass of water?" Say, "Can I have a glass of water?" Listening to it out of context might sound a little rude, but in context, the only thing that they're hearing is command and getting a glass of water. So that is what their brain will register. And it's one of the easier things to just start practicing. Because again, just like the echo technique, it's just something subtle that adds that much more charisma and persuasion to anything that you're doing. And over time, as you practice these things, if you're putting a lot of thought into it, or if you're watching a lot of videos online or listening to a lot of lectures, you could potentially independently figure out a lot of these patterns if you're paying close enough attention.
Awesome. Very good stuff. One last time, is there any audience questions? That
Yeah,
being, go ahead.
I do have a question. Because I noticed that quite a few people have like a brain fog thing happening, right? And I know that a lot of times it's diet or stress or whatever, right?
Mhm.
Do you find that though people that are in that type of state or have like a brain fog thing happening where they're not really that attentive or they're not really that sharp at the moment, do you
Mhm.
find them being more easily persuaded or more susceptible to some of the techniques that people, if they're intentionally trying to do that, um, more susceptible to those types of manipulation, let's call them techniques?
In general, yes. Mostly because those brain fogs come from, um, again, it all goes down to your thoughts are based on your hormones, which is based on your state, but your state is based on your hormones, which is based on your mind. And, you can go in circles all day with that. But at the end of the day, from a neuroscience perspective, stress is a killer of brain function. But specifically, what it kills is the ability to consciously focus your attention. So, mindfulness meditations are very, very useful because they train you to focus your attention on different aspects. So during a mindfulness meditation, you might focus on the sounds within your room or apartment. You might focus on the physical sensations on your body. You direct your attention where you want it. When you are under stress, either prolonged stress, just high cortisol levels, or sudden stress, which is often called fight or flight, um, the hormones that are released either dampen or completely turn off your prefrontal cortex. And that is the part of your brain that helps manage where you direct your attention. So, because of that, what ends up happening is that is effectively what we call a trance. A trance is when um, your ability to control your attention is either dampened or turned off completely. Because what ends up happening is everything that happens around you like, you're not deaf, you can still hear in that state. You're not blind, you can still see, but your brain will not make the decision on what to consciously consider or not. It will not be able to properly focus your awareness, so it simply accepts all information coming in and it will process it later. So because of that, if you have high stress levels, if you're kind of in a daze all the time, or if you're in a state of fear or a state of fight or flight, that specifically will make you more susceptible simply because you are not in control of your attention, which is also why, again, as pacing and leading will put you in that state as well. And just harkening back to news, that is something that simply naturally happens. So people who tend to watch news more will tend to, every time they watch the news, it will become easier and easier for that news station, for that news anchor to put them in that state, not intentionally per se, but they will be more and more susceptible every single time to simply accept and believe everything that they see and hear, because it's bypassing the critical factor. It's bypassing the conscious mind and going directly to the unconscious.
Thank you. That was fantastic.
Thank you. Great stuff. Josh and the show, really appreciate it. I'd love to have you back on anytime that you're able to show again, cover more similar content anytime. For now, do you have any final message or thought you'd like to leave with the audience and those people listening later on YouTube and so forth?
I think the only thing I can think of is, a lot of the stuff can be taught, and it is certainly much easier with a coach like myself to teach this kind of stuff. It helps you along, but if you've been listening, you probably noticed that most of this you can figure out yourself if you're observant enough. So if you're curious and you don't have the money or the time to, find a service online, people watch. It's how I started. Watch people, watch news, watch YouTube, go out to the park and watch and listen. Just see what you figure out.
Well, thank you again. Great stuff. Thank you to everybody for attending in the live audience. Please make sure you've joined the round table and the Temple Mount podcast platforms on YouTube and BitChute and SoundCloud. You can find them all at the top of the Temple Mount Discord server, where we record this every day. Just keep an eye on the announcements channel for upcoming events. There'll be a lot of great ones in the near future. Thanks again, Josh and Michelle, for your time. And everybody, why don't we go ahead and jump to Templar's Tavern, I guess, for the rest of the night and continue to chat down there. Thanks again.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Josh.